Hi, and welcome to the Design Systems Podcast. This podcast is about the place where design and development overlap. We talk with experts to get their point of view about trends in design, code, and how it relates to the world around us. As always, this podcast is brought to you by Knapsack. Check us out at knapsack.cloud. If you want to get in touch with the show, ask some questions, or generally tell us what you think, go ahead and tweet us at the DS Pod. We'd love to hear from you. You can hear my wife talking downstairs. That's super funny. This microphone's so crazy. It's like 2 floors difference between us.
I'm hoping that my 9-year-old doing homeschooling doesn't come barging in. She has strict instructions not to.
It happens, man. I got a 2-year-old and a 2-month-old right now, so it's crazy.
Oh, wow. I've got four-year-old and 9-year-old.
Awesome. God, I can't wait till 4. I'm so excited. Like, having an infant's great, right? I love the fact that I have a baby right now. But like my 2.5-year-old, like he's starting to play games with me, and we love playing hide and seek together, and it's just so fun.
It's much more fun. There's pros and cons at like every stage, and it gets better, and then it gets worse, and then it gets better, and it's just like you see them grow. It's pretty amazing. It's really cool.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. My best buddy has 3 girls, and they're 6'4" and 1 month.
Wow.
Wow. So. Yeah, it's been interesting. And like the girls are so great with my son. They're just like, they take him around everywhere, show him everything. He loves playing over there.
Nice.
Well, anyway, hey, welcome to the podcast. Today I'm with Avery Oldt. He's the Chief Design Officer at Blermph. Tell me about the name of this thing. Like, how did you come up with Blermph? First of all, I love it. Secondly, there's got to be a story here.
Yeah, there's a story. It's Blermph, Blermph, and about 8 years ago, I went off on my own for my own little creative studio, and I really struggled with what to name this thing, and eventually started just searching for nonsense words until I found one that rolled off the tongue at least a little bit eloquently, and that I liked and made me laugh. So it means nothing at all. I made it up, and it was available. That was one of the big things, And it was actually kind of hard to get it all the way through, like registering with the state of California and the federal government without a comma and ink afterwards. Like most companies will force you to do that if you're incorporated. And so it's just Blermph. It's not Blermph Inc., which is another way I just, like to buck the system a little bit. So that's.
Yeah, we chose Knapsack Company because that was one of your options, because we didn't like Knapsack Inc. We wanted to be Knapsack Company. Yeah. So that's where we ended up going with it.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, thank you so much, Avery, for being on the program today. Really appreciate it. Avery has a really interesting story about kind of like life and design and development and how we think about the technology that we use every day. And so I'm super excited to talk to you. You spent a lot of time in various roles in media and banking. I know you were most recently the SVP/head of design at Bank of the West. And so you kind of come from this really diverse background about what design means and how design has kind of evolved and changed as we've seen really sort of the consumerization of applications in our daily life take off. So I'm really excited to chat with you about that. Is there anything specific intro wise or experience wise that you want to chat about real quick?
I had a really long journey to where I am. And I think like probably the most interesting people I work with had similar twists and turns in their careers. I've always been one of those folks who are sort of living at the intersection of product and tech and design, and I think like that interaction is really interesting to me. So I spent, almost a decade just in technology doing front-end engineering, where my medium of design was code, and then moved more heavily specifically into design because my creative desires and like where I got excited about leadership led me there, and I think like following my passion and each one of those twists and turns was really what has made me successful and happy, and I think most of my focus in the last decade has been about leading teams, making them feel individually happy and fulfilled in their work, because I know that creates the best product. So I like to talk about that quite a bit. I spent many years in entertainment at MTV. That shaped me quite a bit in early design systems and interactions, and then more recently startups and some fintech. So really it's been kind of a wild ride all over the place. But, if you focus on fun, which is what I like to do, it seems like a lot quicker ride than it really is.
No, definitely. And it's interesting, too, because I also started as a developer, right? And so now having most of my day-to-day be a lot more about design than it is about development has been kind of an interesting transition for me. And I've known a lot of people that have kind of gone the other way as well, that have started in the design world and sort of moved over into the technical coding side of things. And, we had an earlier episode with Emily Campbell that was a lot about the idea of how they're really two sides of the same coin. And your medium is just the different thing, right? Your language for design, it can be something that is in a Figma file. It can be something that's on paper. It can be something that's like written code in React. It's all just kind of a different medium for this way of expressing ourselves and giving form to things.
Yeah, exactly. Emily's great. We met when I think I attended an Envision talk and we chatted a bit. And the border between these two practices is so porous, and I think there's so much that we're getting now in design systems and that last final mile of design. Like I'm always encouraging designers to really prototype stuff with an engineer. I'm like, you'll get the last mile of what you're thinking of as the design of this thing when you actually sit down and look at it in code. And when you actually do the timing curve, like in CSS, like that transition isn't going to happen, in your design tools and be true to the final implementation. You really should partner up, and that partnering up could be your own skills. Like if you span that border between design and tech yourself, or you just find someone to work with, I think that's where the real magic happens.
Totally. I think that, we oftentimes kind of lump all that into this idea of the democratization of design, right? So you push that last mile of design down to all these different groups of people, and that often involves like this cross-functional team. But I think that sort of misses the point that it is a lot more about the ability to collaborate with people that ultimately own that final medium. I think that that's an important factor.
Yeah. And so much of the friction, like whenever I, enter an organization and trying to transform them from, A to Z or whatever journey we're on, whenever I discover friction in the org and where there's tension between two groups, it's always in this sort of like us versus them thing where design is like, well, the engineers implemented this poorly, or the engineers are like, they're building impossible things that we can't actually do in a web browser. A lot of it is just that sort of, lack of understanding of the other person and lack of communication. Like in old school, you'd throw things over the wall and hope that it gets implemented the way you want it. And now it's like, this person is sitting right next to you. You really should just chat. And there's a lot of things that you would probably excite each other about if you saw and respected or just understood work. And a lot of that just takes talking. It's just like walking up to that person and saying, hey, I want to show you some stuff. Can you tell me if this is realistic, or can this work, or how do we find the solution together, kind of thing?
And you've had this wonderfully diverse kind of background of organizations, and you've been doing this for a while. And so you've got to witness firsthand this transition from quote, old school to the way that we all think about it right now, right? And simultaneously, a lot about consumer applications has changed, right? Anything that is now user facing has this just much higher standard than it ever really has before. And you think about all of the things that enabled that, the existence of the iPhone and the App Store, and then all of a sudden, all these organizations that were leading with design. You think of Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, Twitter, Facebook, all these things that really made it so that the apps we use for fun have really raised the bar for the apps we also use for work, and the stuff that maybe isn't as fun, like banking. And so that consumerization sort of swing is something you've got to witness firsthand. Talk to me about how that's changed for you.
Yeah, I think over time it was so much more of a utility to have a web browser and have technology and software that did a task. It was much more of a utility. But now that those consumer apps are so pervasive, the percentage of people who are online, who are using smartphones, who are downloading apps, is so high these days that the bar is just raised naturally over time, right? And I think it drives this sort of intentionality with teams who are building products that, and it's funny because you mentioned banking. I've said to people in finance, when we're looking at our own work, when we're evaluating our products, I've said, take a look at this app, right? Is this good? Because you go home at night and watch Netflix and order stuff on Amazon, and you get a Lyft to go to work, and you use those other apps every day. Evaluate our work against that bar, right? There's nothing that says we can't build those things as well. It's all about just making the choice and having the intentionality to realize everything around us, somebody made a design decision about. And we can make those decisions too.
So thinking about that and viewing things through that lens, how have you helped organizations make that transition? Because I mean, you think about things today, right, where there's so much change happening in our digital world. We've taken 10 years of work in the way that we think about our culture, and we've compressed it into 6 months, largely because this pandemic has made it so that it's hard to go shop for shoes or a jacket or a new outfit in a store. It's hard to go to the grocery store and pick out groceries. So how do you make this transition if you're someone that is, you know, a retailer or a bank or something like that, looking at a much bigger digital landscape and a much bigger demand from consumers for digital experiences?
Yeah, a lot of it, I think, you know, there's been a big trend in user experience design and user experience language and sort of brand ideology over the last, I don't know, 5-8 years, where it's like everyone's saying be more human, right? It's like be more human. We want to be more human. And I laugh because I'm like, aren't we all humans?
I feel like I'm pretty human.
Right. So it got me thinking about, is the tendency for corporate business office politics to slide the other way, to slide away from being human. And I think it is. Like over time, the last century, we put on suits, we go into the office, we develop language around how we work together. You have the really funny, like, you know, memes about corporate jargon and meetings and how they're awful and everybody hates meetings. And I think we just tend to put on this artifice, you know, and it's all about posturing and formality and who's in charge and all this stuff. So what I do a lot when I go into a new organization to help them transform is really just say, hey, we're all people, right? Like this is, when we say be more human, it's really about just informal communication.
You're saying that you bubble up new paradigms to enable digital transformation through innovation and I'm fucking with you.
It's all about synergy. No,
right, synergy, right. That's my favorite punching bag word.
Synergy. And I almost never use the word innovation, right? And I almost never use the term design thinking, because I really think that a lot of those things, even though the philosophies behind them are great and help us advance every day in this world, they're off-putting to a lot of people. You know, they're off-putting. They make some people feel small. I think like just talking person to person, saying like, hey, this is what we do. This is how we could build that thing together, right? I think that goes a really long way in just forming the relationships that drive great products. So I'm not dogmatic about process. Like I don't want to say we're going to use, you know, this tool, Asana or Jira, or we're going to follow this process, or we're going through this design thinking model. Like I'd rather say, let's just get in front of a whiteboard and sketch something out. Let's do whatever works. If you're part of an org long term, then you mint the thing that works really well. And then that's your process, right? And it's more about we're the humans that created that in our relationship, rather than we read a book or took a class and then implemented that exact same thing dogmatically. I think that's where Agile has gone wrong over the last couple of years, where bigger and bigger organizations, you know, in finance and healthcare and large corporations have implemented Agile, moving away from waterfall, but they've done it all wrong. Like it's all super dogmatic. It's very formulaic. Like there's not a lot of freedom in the system to have a real stand-up.
Right. Just have a scrum team and everybody gives status for half an hour and then we all go on with our days.
Exactly.
Go get the real work done. I'm joking a little bit, but I think that there is a serious resistance to a lot of these ideas that get put out there sort of into the ether, the zeitgeist of business, right? As you think about, you know, if you're a part of a scrum team or you're a part of a design thinking group or an innovation cluster, any other number of terms for these sort of people outside the norm, just setting them apart is one thing. And I'm actually reminded of a boss that I used to have that, you know, I was talking about a marketing campaign that we were working on. I was like, you know, I think that we could really benefit from some design thinking around this, about how we can work on metaphors and stuff like that. And he literally pretended to know what design thinking was for like a whole month and a half, until he was like, wait, okay, so I need you to just like actually tell me, like, what does design thinking mean? I mean, you know, that sort of thing is like what no organization should have to face. You should not have to feel stupid or uninvolved because you don't totally understand what you're talking about. And when you sit down and you say, like, all design thinking really is making sure that you have a design eye towards the experience you're creating for people. Anyway, I think that that's a fascinating take on this, is that, you know, despite all the buzzwords that are out there, like, there is a real substance here, and that is the people involved and talking through that process with them in a way that makes them feel comfortable.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny, like, design is made of people, almost, you know, like Soylent Green. Like that's what design is. It's people being intentional about their choices, and it's not some magical thing that you can commoditize and buy off the shelf. Like you could pour millions of dollars into design thinking for your organization. And if you don't change the culture and the relationships and how you talk to one another, you won't really get anywhere.
There's a conference t-shirt there that is like a green t-shirt with like a cookie, a person-shaped cookie on it that says like design is people or something.
Yep. Design is made of people. I think really like there's basic psychology around this stuff. Just on introspection, letting go of your ego and asking questions and being open to being asked questions like that. That's a lot of the stuff that I focus on when I work with teams and new organizations, because that's where you actually get the big change from all those small moves, and you can label them however you want after they start working. But I think before they start working, you really just have to, on a human level, talk to people.
When you think about like that process at, and I like you think about fintech or finance is a little bit maybe more stodgy about that sort of thing, right? Like at least certainly a more conservative place design wise than say MTV.
Yep.
How do you take those lessons from a place like MTV where I'm sure, design was kind of at the forefront of a lot of the ways that people thought, and apply that to a place like a bank where that maybe is something that's a little bit more in the background?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like I have a funny story. When I started at Bank of the West, there was a designer there who we were on the way to a meeting and she was worried about wearing her nose ring to the meeting. And she was like, I have to stop at my desk and take out I'm like, what are you talking about? And she told me that someone had told her in the past that it was inappropriate. And I was like, okay, hang on, like time out.
Wait a second.
Put that thing back in. Don't worry about it. Sit next to me. We're changing this culture, right? That how you present your style has nothing to do with your skills and experience in the workplace, And so, like I say at MTV, like there was no nudity. That was kind of the dress code. And I think this is really true for designers and engineers. Like your personal style and your personality and where you come from and your experience really helps, influence how you do your job, right? So if I'm running a show and I'm telling you can't be who you are, then I've already failed, right? So I think you make this change anywhere, however conservative it is, inch by inch, by really getting to know people and making sure they understand you're not discounting their experience, right? So there's some old school engineers in this business who come into design systems with like 30 years of tech, right? And some people might discount that, right? They might think, well, like, man, you're on COBOL and stuff. Like this is like, we don't need you anymore. But that would be a huge mistake because those folks actually been thinking about logic behind programming for decades, right? They will come up with solutions faster than lots of these, younger folks. And putting those two groups together is where you actually get a lot of success. The same is true for anything like finance. So like if you meet someone who's been in retail banking or mortgage banking, like I was at a startup for digital mortgage before Bank of the West, it was called Lending Home. There were lots of mix there of like folks who've been in mortgage for years and years and startup folks who are like, we're going to make this all online and put it in the cloud. And it was that sort of interaction between those two groups when they were friendly and open and respected each other and listened that really actually made a great product, right? It wasn't just one-sided.
No, and I absolutely agree with that. I think that, we were doing a design system one time where we had this group that was kind of like the old guard of the engineering team, right? They were very invested in the more monolithic like CMS architecture because that's what they knew and that's what they spent, a decade working on and building up tooling around and everything like that. And then you go and all of a sudden say like, all right, well, we're going to separate the front end from that and we're going to create this design system out of it. And they're like, oh my gosh, this is a huge waste of time. I can't ever imagine like, using this in an effective way. But really what it was about for them was about feeling like this lack of control of the process all of a sudden, right? Like for them, there was this thing that they basically run themselves for 10 years. And now that was in their mind being taken away from them. And I think that creating that culture or that place that respected those feelings and allowed them to express that sort of, not really resentment, more, calamity, that was really key. And what was amazing is the outcome of that conversation ended up being a much stronger design system product in the end.
Yeah. And, like Google did a big study about this and people talk about it a lot, like really productive and successful teams have a component of psychological safety that really drives their success. So a lot of what holds us back is fear. So talking with those folks who may not want change and really understanding and not dismissing it all, what are they actually afraid of, right? Without asking that pointed question, like, what are you afraid of? Because that can be off-putting. Really understanding where they're coming from and the value that they feel their system has, and understand, okay, we have to build that into the new system, or we have to demonstrate how our new thing does what the old thing did, only better, because it's a different paradigm, right? How can we convince them? Because that actually is your audience. So as designers, I'm always talking to product designers and content strategists and saying, like, the people you work with inside the building who aren't in this group may not understand what you do. They are your audience just as much as the consumer who's going to download the app that you're trying to build, right? Use those tools that to reach your audience, to do research with that audience, to actually talk to them and figure out what would be successful sell of this new thing, this new leap in tech or culture or design that we want. How could I convince them that it works? Right.
Yeah. And I think like thinking about that broader constituency, and I've always loved the idea of when you're building a design system, spending a lot of time researching your first level consumer, right? All the apps that ultimately consume your design system, and all those teams and all those designers and developers and people that ultimately use your design system to build stuff. Because that's kind of like your first line consumer. And like, yeah, it's all about the user in the end. It's all about getting the right product to the broader marketplace. But, along the way, it has to go through a lot of other people, and spending the time to really understand their needs. That helps with adoption, that helps with building a stronger system, that helps with buy-in, that helps with the ability to basically take something that would you not think about like as a traditionally designed progressive organization and really making a beautiful, elegant experience for people.
Yeah. One of the last frontiers of this space is internal applications, right? So you think of externally, the bar has been raised. All consumers expect everything to work just like Facebook and Instagram or Gmail. Like they want it to be functionable, usable, internal systems like the tools that, the retail store employee uses to
right, your HR app,
or like the the green screen behind the counter at the airport when they're trying to change your seat. That stuff is actually a really exciting frontier of improving the lives of people who work on these systems every day. Like, your app that you may use for banking or social, you could use it for an hour a day or 5 minutes a day. But like there are people who work on some of these applications for 8, 10, 12 hours a day. You could actually introduce like a ton of happiness in the world if you made those better.
Now, those poor people that changing airline seats, it looks like they're playing like Dwarf Fortress. Seriously, like it's all like ASCII and it's like sort of looks like a plane, maybe if you squint right. And they have to like, there's no clicking. They have to just like command line everything. I can't even imagine having that job.
Yeah, it's funny. I used that metaphor when I was at Restoration Hardware. As a director of e-commerce and user experience, we had, an AS400 green screen application in stores to order furniture. So if you wanted a sofa, you would have to stand behind the counter while somebody like tapped, just like they were making a seat change at the airline on this green screen with F keys, and you would just hear all this clackety clack noise. There were no pictures. So often mistakes happen because the associate couldn't verify that's the leg that I need with this sofa. That's the ottoman that goes with this set kind of thing. So a lot of errors. And the consumer hated it, right? So it was that metaphor that really opened up the eyes of the internal team to be like, oh, wow, ordering a sofa is like, being at the counter at the airline, super painful. And we turned around and made a web app, it wasn't a native app. We made a web app for iPads that actually the associate could go and basically use the same e-commerce platform we had for consumers online to make an order for the customer while sitting on the sofa they wanted to get, and show them colorways and all this stuff. And it was amazing. And it didn't take that long to build, but it took having that tough conversation of saying, like, I know we have a lot invested in this old system, but it's really like dying on the vine. And we gotta make a big shift here. There's a couple good ways we can make that leap with low tech things and look really great. and the consumers loved it. Like orders went through the roof. That platform started to put through, hundreds of millions of dollars faster than the AS400 system did, and it was a fantastic win.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that people underestimate that friction reduction. And I agree, it's kind of this last frontier. And where I see evidence of this most prevalently is in POS systems, right? So you look at the rise of Square and Toast and, all of these other Clover and all these other systems for restaurants, right? Where people want an iPad that they can take orders on, and they want that experience to not be old school POS restaurantware that has generally been pretty terrible. And a large part of that is reducing friction in the ordering process. And now with COVID, you're even seeing like online menuing and stuff like that, where you can get, food delivered to your table without ever having to talk to a server. And, it's a really interesting place where you've seen that consumerization paradigm really take off over the last, 5 years. And now you could see other back office applications benefiting from really similar things.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of lessons. We can learn so much from this pandemic in the last 7 months of being on lockdown and having retail foot traffic, reduced significantly, is that it's time to go to, the C-suite and the board and say, like, chance favors the well-prepared. And we were not well prepared for this, right? We were not, we ignored some decisions. We put off some decisions on reducing our technical debt. We put off some decisions on making a really great design team. Now is the time to really make those moves, to weather the storm for however long this is going to go on and get to the next leap, right? There's another evolution of retail coming. What is that going to mean? And do you want to be 2 cycles behind, or 1 cycle behind, or a half cycle behind?
Yeah, so that actually brings up an interesting point too, because you're seeing with, the modern world also just this like explosion of apps, right? Just, talking to our customers and the people that we know in the industry, people are maintaining 30, 50, 300% more apps than they were a year ago, largely because the rush to meet the demand for remote, lockdown life, it was kind of this gold rush towards where the dollars went, right? Like if people aren't walking into stores, well, meet them in their homes.
Yeah.
And so that's just created this massive proliferation on a scale I don't think that we've ever seen before. Where do you see that going?
Yeah, I think, this is actually where I think in our Convo design systems actually shows its value, right? So when that surface area of, your company or all the apps in your, portfolio just explodes, the only way to approach that at scale is have some systematic way. I'm very much about like discovering what works, having human to human relationships, and talking about like how to actually build great products. But when you do get to a scale that's just enterprise level, you do need a way to attack that so that it's sustainable, right? If you just add a new app every month because you're trying to respond to the pandemic and do something, like if those apps don't have an overarching strategy of here's how we're rolling out, here's how the brand changes now because we're not physical, now we're native app, or we're not physical, now we're only web. Like if you don't have a strategy for that, you are gonna hit a wall after so many months. Like if you keep adding new surface area, but you don't have a way to update that surface area, this is why there was a big struggle between responsive, and multi-channel years ago, because a lot of companies just said, well, we're going to add a mobile website, right? We have a website. Right. We're just going to add a mobile website. And what you did, if you didn't staff up for it, is you just made everyone's job twice as hard, right? The engineers have to support 2 code bases. The designers have to consider multiple screen views. Responsive is the solution to that. Like responsive builds across multiple screen sizes in this continuum, and I think there's several ways that you can approach that with specific breakpoints or just fluid design. That is actually the real long-term solve. The companies who adopted that earlier had less maintenance overhead. They had, easier way to update stuff. The same is true now today of design systems.
Definitely. I absolutely see the parallels between responsive web design and sort of the advent and I guess the confusion around the way to do it for a while there. Because I think design systems are still really confusing for many people to try to understand, like, how do I leverage this? And, one of the interesting conversations is how kind of in the previous part, we were talking about internal back office applications, how that follows the idea of innovation through design systems on the consumer facing side, right? So, your consumer apps come online, people realize the value of a single system to help maintain, manage, and scale on the consumer app side, and then that gives them the inkling or the seeds for the idea of how to do it internally as well.
Right. Yeah, and I think like having, it's again back to like communication and language. If we make this thing called design systems or design pattern libraries or however we want to approach it, if we make it sound like foreign and hip and complicated, it reduces, the adoption really. Like if we make it more about, I think, what you say at Knapsack, build without rebuilding, and like make it just about like, hey, we're going to reuse stuff. We're not going to pay for this thing twice. Like, let's not do the work 10 times. Let's do it, once or twice. And that's an idea that is really appealing to the folks who run the budgets and, control the money and run the business. Like, that is the angle you have to take, like know your audience. Maybe you don't call it design systems for the first 10 meetings or first presentation. You just say like, we figured out a way to reuse things efficiently and lower costs.
Yeah, it sounds like you're talking about our sales strategy right now.
Exactly.
No, there is a lot of intention behind the idea of focusing on reuse as the most critical piece of this, right? Because that's something that everybody understands. It's like when you say, I built a fintech app or I built a MarTech app, that means a lot of things to a lot of different people. I built a design system means a lot of things right now. It could mean I have a really well-structured sketch library. It could mean I have a really well-structured set of coded components. It could be I have a workflow inside of my organization that looks first at what I've already built instead of thinking about comping. And all of those things are kind of like related to this conceptual idea of design systems. And so I think that is where a lot of confusion comes from. Much like you said before with like, I don't remember if you said design ops or design thinking, but either way, like those terms end up carrying a lot with them. And so trying to keep it as like a simplistic core concept as possible, I think is really important to getting people to understand like what's the goal of all this.
Yeah. Yeah. So like I put on LinkedIn recently that the most effective design system is trust, right? So the more that you trust each other in the workplace or in whatever creative studio you're in, the more that you can talk to each other and trust each other, that's going to be the most effective path, and I think, it's so much more powerful than forcing someone to do something or saying we're doing this now because I'm in charge. It usually flops after a while.
No, absolutely. I feel like you're sort of channeling Stephen Gates with that too, because we had a whole conversation about why trust is so essential to the success of these systems, largely because of that idea of safety, that idea of a place where expression, that idea of a place where ideas are valued, that idea that like you could accomplish more as a bank than Airbnb. That sort of opening up of this idea space is really based in trust.
Yeah. And trust is a lot about, feeling that someone else understands and respects you, right? So if you know your audience, if you're a designer or a researcher or content strategist, and you know your audience internal where you need to pitch and sell these, new paradigms, really knowing what is valuable to them is important, right? So if you're trying to pitch like continuity of brand and making everything look the same everywhere and it's pixel perfect, that's not super important to finance, right? That's not super important even sometimes to engineering, or legal and compliance. But what is super important is cost, speed. So I sell maintainability, like technical debt. Like what I usually start a lot of pitch around design systems and repeatable patterns is saying like, I want you, product manager or business analyst or director of one of our channels, I want you to be able to have an idea in the morning, sit down with someone who, has access to whatever CMS or storybook or whatever tool we're using, sit down in the morning, put a couple of things together and launch that page at the end of the day, right? And in a lot of companies, that's just normal operations. Like you're doing continuous integration and development. That's just normal. You just do that all the time. But for so many institutions, that is like complete like alien futuristic. They have no idea it's possible, right? And
absolutely. And I would say that that's the majority of organizations. I would say that it's sort of the exception to say I could sit down, a designer and a developer could sit down at 8 a.m. and launch an actual, prototype or even production app by 5 p.m.
Yep.
I would say that's a rarity.
Yeah. And the magical part of that is, you wrap up that conversation by saying, no one's going to get in trouble for what you do because it's already approved. It's already pre-approved. You don't have to go through 10 steps of saying, this is what we put together. Is it okay? And have somebody tweak and redline and go through several rounds of review because we've actually already built the stuff. Engineering has made it like basically bulletproof so the components interact well against each other. You might have like one case where somebody's like, oh, that's not really how we plan to use that component, but that gives me a great idea on how to build a new one. Right. And then that's where really great design happens, is when you're like, the system we have has a couple blind spots. Let's actually spend our time looking at those blind spots instead of just stamping out mock-ups of the same stuff we've done for the last 2 years.
Yeah, I don't think that anybody, and I've said this before, right? I don't think that anybody's like particularly excited to create yet another sticker sheet of buttons when you add a font, right? But I think that what people are excited about is to basically say like, hey, this card experience is not exactly what I want. What if I change this like 20% of it, add a couple of new options to give us some more creative ability inside of a card component?
Yeah. And that's sort of like the culture we're talking about, and that speed really creates a lot of opportunities for individuals on these teams to go deep on where their excitement is, right? So you may have designers or engineers who really want to focus on one specific thing. They're like, I just want to crank out wireframes and workflows and journey maps all day long. There's a space for that in an org that has a good stable 80% of the design work sort of done and approved, right? That gives you the power to have somebody really perfect your UI in a way that would make your forms so efficient and like so high on conversion, you'd actually impact revenue really positively. And that doesn't have to be the same person who's designing the new stuff for, conversion funnel pages, right? Like you kind of separate those two roles. You have your journey team and your assembly team, and some of the stuff that Andrew Roman's been talking about for Knapsack, like that's really exciting, right? Because it doesn't like homogenize the whole team and make everybody think, well, I have to be full stack or I have to be, exactly the same product designer as everyone else. There's space for really good diversity of skill across a healthy team like that.
Right. And it also elevates the pattern. I think that is a sort of a key concept that we find is emerging just in the design system space as a whole, is this idea that sure, there's components, sure, there's design tokens, but it's really all patterns at the end of the day. Those patterns have a lot of flexibility and diversity around them, largely because it can be something as big as a journey and it can be something as small as a color contrast. And so I think that when we think about how we create this more encompassing, inclusive, trustful sort of environment, we all just think about like we're all building patterns together. And that's been kind of a revelation, even within the past year, that we've sort of seen happening in the marketplace, as everybody is starting to say like, all right, so I built a component library. Awesome. What does that actually mean? And then we actually say like, all right, now I have a pattern-based approach to things. Now people start to understand like, oh, okay, a pattern-based approach. It's about the people. It's about, yes, the components, but it's also about so much more than that.
Yep. Yeah. And that's kind of like what I mentioned, how I talk about process, like design process and team process. Like you kind of do what works. You work through the messiness of figuring out what's the actual successful pattern, and then you mint that, right? So it's similar to how you approach design patterns. And I think the same applies to language. Like it applies to your customer service model. Like what's actually the pattern of successful outcome emotionally for your audience? And how can you repeat that over and over again, right? So it's way more than just buttons and type and form fields and error messages. And, it's like actually much bigger, right? And I think pattern recognition is a basic human behavior, and you could be wildly successful if you avoid the pitfall of being too much of a design nerd and going way too deep on your library and without taking a breath and being like, why am I doing this? And what actually is the usefulness for the experience?
Designing for dribble instead of for production.
Yes.
I think that all of that is a really interesting way of thinking about the future, right? Like if we are able to take a pattern-based approach and apply it to design systems and the way we think about design and development, if we're able to extend that into kind of new frontiers like content, I mean, that's one place that I'm very excited, is I really want to talk about like patterns and content and then even also to process and the way we think about the delivery of value as support, as customer management, as touch points through the organization. All of these are interesting frontiers for where this could all go.
Yeah, it's super exciting, and it kind of breaks the mold of previous thinking around design systems being largely visual. Like if you're really, a lot of folks will, especially over the past few years, design systems have become really popular. The most basic representation of them is a visual sticker sheet, right? And so you kind of limit it a little bit from going into those other areas you mentioned. And I think language is a really great one. I think the journey for the customer is a really great one. Like you could have the greatest sticker sheet in the world and have the best, individual steps in a process. But if that process is too long, then you're going to like kill your conversion funnel, right? So like, how do you document a pattern of communication with the audience that shows where you can have more or less conversion, right? And that's a way that the language you use, what you ask them for, what you give them after they provide what you've asked for. Like there's a lot more patterning there that could be pretty powerful beyond just the visual.
Absolutely. Well, it's been super great to talk about this stuff, the new frontiers that we could go with design systems, the history of where we've been and the consumerization and how we've all dealt with this change. I just really appreciate you being on, sharing your wisdom and experience with us. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Chris. I mean, I'm thrilled to join. I love the roster you've had on this podcast, and I can't wait to hear the final cut and do it again. Like talking about this stuff is just so great. I want more people to understand patterns and systems and how humans are a big part of that. So thank you so much.
So we always talk about something that is like a little personal or off color for these things. You are, needless to say, a big fan of beards, given that you have one of the more impressive beard and mustache combos that I have personally seen. You said you had a beard story. I want to hear this beard story.
I do have a beard story. I grew this thing. I have a 26-year-old photo of me speaking at graduation when I was 17 or 18 and had a beard back then, right? But it was very trimmed and small, right? So I have not been growing this for 26 years. But I've had this little monster pet on my face for about 4 or 5 years. And 2 years ago, I was sitting with my sketchbook and I sketched a little scraggly beard. And then I got a promo from Sticker Mule, my favorite sticker vendor. And I was like, I'm going to make some beard stickers, right? Everybody's always like complimenting me on my beard or asking how long it takes to grow, mostly weird folks. And so now I had the whole stack of stickers. I started giving them out like to anyone who asked about my beard. And now I've like reordered, and now I have like hologram foil ones and clear ones, and then a skull with like my family name on it, and all these like different hats that I switched. So I've somehow become like a sticker weirdo. And it's all about the beards. And it's been really fun because I actually post this stuff on LinkedIn and Instagram on my account Design Beardo. And I tell people like, hey, just like send me your contact info and I'll drop you a stack of stickers. And so like I get strangers or just designers or friends. They're like, give me some. And then I get a sticker of it or a photo of it on a skateboard or a water bottle. And it's just really, nice. It's really fun. Yeah. Yeah.
So you get the deluge of Twitter DMs from this, hopefully asking for stickers.
Yes, I don't go on Twitter much. Instagram is better for me, but yeah, please DM me wherever you can find Design Beardo or Avery Oldt, and I will send you a sticker.
Take it from the guy whose beard oil budget is probably more than my overall haircut budget. So he's got this epic thing. I wish you guys could see it right now. Maybe we'll post. You know what? We'll post a link and a photo in the show notes.
That'd be fun. Yeah.
All right. Hey, thanks again, Avery. I really appreciate it. Super great chatting with you. And let's have you back on again soon.
Thank you.
That's all for today. This has been another episode of the Design Systems Podcast. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions or a topic you'd like to know more about, find us on Twitter at the DS Pod. We'd love to hear from you with show ideas, recommendations, questions, or comments. As always, this pod is brought to you by Knapsack. You can check us out at knapsack.cloud. Have a great day.